In the spring of 1943, 1 year after we lost our mother, our family moved to Hiranomachi in the city of Hiroshima. My father, Yoshiaki, my new stepmother, Taka, my brother, Mamoru, my sister Hiroko, and I lived in a house located in a quiet residential area. It faced a sports ground owned by Hiroshima University. Large camphor trees in the sports ground gave shelter from sunlight. It was my favorite place to play, especially in the heat of summer. In 1945, I was 7 years old and in the second grade of primary school. War had increased its intensity. Blackout regulations required all windows of the houses to be covered by black curtains at night to prevent any glimmer of light from escaping. We were in constant fear because of the disconcerting rumble of Boeing 29s flying overhead several times a day. Air raid sirens kept us restless day and night. One day, a few American fighters flew so low and started strafing from such close range that I felt as if I could reach out and touch them. Once the air raid siren sounded, we were shaken out of bed and had to move to the bomb shelter that had been dug under the house. It was not uncommon for our classes to be interrupted. In order to make up for missed classes, we went to school during summer vacation wearing thick hoods over our heads and long pants. On August 6, 1945, the sky was clear. At the time, female students worked in factories, but on that day, my sister Hiroko had a day off and went out to see her friends. My brother had been evacuated to our friend Mr. Kiritani's house in Takehara, 40 kilometers east from Hiroshima 1 month earlier. My father was in Onomichi, further to the east on prefectural government business. Only my stepmother and I were in the house. After breakfast, I could not find my name tag before going to school. Then a girl named Michiko came by and said, "Let's play." She used to live with her parents in Kure, where there was a naval base. But her parents sent her to her grandparents' house 3 doors down from our house in Hiranomachi. They thought she would be safer there than in Kure. In fact, bombing attacks on Kure had become quite frequent, and we sometimes saw the skies over Kure ablaze. Michiko's grandfather was a retired rear admiral, and my father was a retired Army Major General. They used to visit each other for a chat or meal. As Michiko went to a private school and I went to send a public school, we didn't have the same schedule. That day, Michiko came over to our house to play with me, as she usually did when her school was closed. I told her, "I can't play because I have school," and she turned to go home. I finally found my name tag. In the 1 or 2 seconds it took to put it on my shirt, the atomic bomb exploded. At the same time, I was looking at the intense white flash outside the kitchen window. I glanced at the clock, and the vision of the hands pointing to 8:15 is still seared into my memory. In that instant, our house collapsed, burying me in the rubble. I didn't know what happened to my stepmother. All I was thinking about was how I could get out. Despite being trapped under the roof face down, I did not have trouble breathing, as there must have been a narrow passage for the air to flow. By struggling desperately, I was able to crawl out of the rubble. I was fortunate not to be trapped by heavy beams or pillars. It is terrifying to think that I could have been burnt alive by the fire that started later if I had been pinned down by a heavy beam. I can still clearly recall how I looked when I crawled out of the rubble. I was covered in dirt and dust from head to toe. My stepmother was also able to somehow crawl out. Other houses in the neighborhood were all destroyed. and we realized that our house was not the only one that had been bombed. As broken pieces of glass, bricks, and concrete were strewn all over the street, we returned to the half-collapsed house to get our shoes. Filled with fright, the thought of taking valuables out of the rubble never crossed our minds. When we stepped out of the gate, we found Michiko standing there, badly burned and looking deathly pale. The sleeveless dress she had worn when she came to see me had been totally burned away, and she was almost naked. She was badly burned from her back to her bottom, with her skin peeling away and hanging loose. She had been drawing pictures on the pavement with chalk as usual. My stepmother couldn't leave Michiko alone. Michiko walked after us feebly while weeping. As we met a crowd of the injured and the burned walking in the same direction, we followed them. People with burns over their entire body walked, holding both arms out in front like ghosts to prevent them from touching their body. If touched, they would suffer intense pain. Michiko walked like the other burn victims. Strangely, my stepmother and I were generally unharmed despite being just 1.7 kilometers from ground zero. My stepmother had a cut she got while under the rubble. I had a cut, probably caused by something like a piece of glass, and a slight burn on my right arm, which I did not notice until a blister formed. As we walked along, we met many victims asking for water. They pleaded, "Please, please give me water." On the other hand, there was also a strange rumor going around that drinking water would be fatal and that people must not drink water. Half in doubt, we also refrained from drinking. It was practically impossible to find drinkable water as almost all the buildings had collapsed. We learned later that seriously burned victims needed to drink more water than usual, but in the chaotic conditions, many of them died of thirst and in agony without taking a sip. Victims near the hypocenter walked down into the river for water and died there, and the rivers were covered with floating bodies.
We walked for hours and finally arrived at the large general hospital near Hijiyama, a hill located in the southern part of Hiroshima city. In the hospital, there was already a jumble of bodies piled high. We saw trucks loaded with bodies going out. Many citizens had rushed to the hospital for help, but the hospital was short of staff and medicine. Burn victims had red mebromen, topical antiseptic, and a white ointment like zinc oil applied to their burns, which gave their entire bodies a pink tint. The antiseptic and zinc ointment had no effect on the burns caused by exposure to high doses of radiation and heat rays. Men and women stained and pink lay on the floor, and I could not tell whether they were alive or not. We found a place in the shade. A mother holding a week-old baby was seated next to us. I was worried about whether the baby would be fed and had diapers. Michiko's body was badly damaged due to direct exposure to radiation. She must have used the last remnants of her strength to get to the hospital. She could not even sit upright and collapsed on the floor. My stepmother stopped a nurse and said, "Please do something for little Michiko. She is the granddaughter of an admiral. Please, please, take good care of her." Needless to say, nurses had no time to attend to Michiko and the terrible conditions. A little later, another nurse came and gave Michiko something like a cardiotonic injection. Still, she showed no response. Even as a child, I doubted that any shot would be powerful enough to cure Michiko. However, it made me feel better that Michiko got a special treatment. My stepmother became anxious to find out what became of our collapsed house. She told Michiko, "We are going to see how our house is," and left her. I do not know if Michiko was conscious or could understand what she said. I was filled with sorrow and guilt when I thought we would not come back to the hospital again. I left the hospital with painful reluctance, and I remained extremely anxious about what became of Michiko. Even more than 60 years later, I can clearly recall the scene of little Michiko lying limply on the concrete floor of the corridor.
It was probably past 1 o'clock when we left. In the morning, when we were walking about to find a safe place, we had not seen any fires. However, after just a few hours, Hiroshima had been turned into a burnt field. In an instant, the city of Hiroshima and the lives and homes of the people living there were totally destroyed. As far as the eye could see, there was nothing but ruins. We thought it difficult to find the site of our house, as most of the landmarks were reduced to ashes. My stepmother took me by the hand and walked in the supposed direction of Hiranomachi. On the way, I saw a man sitting with one of his legs raised. He was very thin, almost skin and bone. At first, I thought he was just resting, but as I got closer, I realized he was dead. He must have been having a smoke at the moment the bomb exploded and died in that posture. He didn't scare me too much, as I had seen bodies piled up and overloaded in trucks. I just passed him by with no feelings. I was not shocked, horrified, or sad, although I had never seen bodies like that in my life until that day. Could there be an experience more dreadful and abnormal than seeing bodies piled up in the blink of an eye? Thinking back, getting accustomed to piles of bodies was also dreadful and abnormal. After we walked from the hospital for 30 to 40 minutes, we met a soldier handing out hard, dry biscuits to the lucky ones who happened to be passing by. As we hadn't had any food or drink since breakfast, we accepted his favor with thanks. We kept walking toward the side of our house. Finally, we found it was burnt down to ashes. There was nothing left. One thing we found was a 20-centimeter high statue of Kwannon, commonly worshipped as the goddess of mercy in Japanese Buddhism. The statue had been treasured by my father. We also found a rice steamer blackened and deformed beyond repair. 5 of us used it to cook watery rice porridge with the small amount of rationed rice which we shared. My stepmother picked up only the Kwannon statue from the rubble. Many refugees escaped to the Hiroshima University sports ground in front of our house. The huge camphor trees that had been covered by rich foliage were burned, and the leaves had turned brown. Toward sunset, a soldier who worked for my father built a small shanty for us near the camphor trees. The sports ground was filled with countless refugees. They were exhausted and sat with empty gazes, or simply lay on the dirt.
My father hurriedly returned to Hiroshima from Onomichi. On the way back to Hiroshima, he expected the worst and had asked his men to bury the bodies at the base of the camphor tree if he found my stepmother and me dead. At a distance of 1.7 kilometers from the hypocenter, each household lost at least one family member, and it was not rare that whole family died. I heard Michiko's grandparents died instantly. It was truly fortunate that my stepmother and I survived without serious injury. However, we did not know the whereabouts of my sister, who had left the house early in the morning. My father walked about in search of my sister every day, visiting shelters, hospitals, and schools, which were likely to accommodate the injured and recover the dead. We later learned that my sister was outdoors waiting for her friends when the bomb exploded. She was blown over by the blast and suffered injuries and burns. However, thanks to the red parasol she was holding, she did not suffer burns as severely as Michiko. She fled toward the north and was saved by a kind person who let her stay for a night. The next day, she got to Mr. Kiritani's house, where my brother had already been evacuated. My stepmother and I stayed in the small shanty for several days. Rice bowl was served to the refugees at times. As far as the eye could see, there was nothing but burnt-out ruins. Every night, I saw fires here and there. I heard adults say they are burning the dead bodies, and winds sometimes brought an indescribable smell. A partly destroyed janitor's shed stood on the north end of the sports ground. It had been saved from burning down. Thanks to the faucet there, we were able to get drinking water. The large window panes of the hut had all been blown out. When I got closer to the hut, I noticed something was hanging from the windowsill. It was around 50 centimeters long and looked like a human body part, something like a thigh. I supposed a person who had been near the hut must have been blown apart by the blast, and part of their leg got hooked on the windowsill. In order to collect water, I had to pass the flesh hanging from the window. Although I had seen countless numbers of bodies and was accustomed to them, it was different this time. I was so scared that I could not ask my stepmother and other adults what it was. 3 days later, on August 9th, we learned that another new type bomb had been dropped on Nagasaki. Adults cried out with fear and anxiety, though no one knew what the bomb really was.
A Mr. Fujishima, who had worked under my father, offered to let us stay at his house in Rakurakuen, a town located midway between Hiroshima and Miyajima Island. We moved there on August 10th or 11th. Many refugees from Hiroshima were staying in the neighborhood. They died one after another after showing symptoms such as high fever, frequent diarrhea and vomiting, losing clumps of hair, purple spots on the body, and bleeding from the gums. Maggots were also crawling in their open wounds and burns. It was at Mr. Fujishima's house that I heard Emperor Hirohito speak on the radio on August 15th. due to the poor reception, I barely heard what he said at first. But I soon understood that Japan had lost and that the war was over. I recollect clearly that even as a child, I was so relieved, but I was anxious when I thought about our future. That winter, I heard through our acquaintance that Michiko had died 2 days after we last saw her. It was a cold night, and I heard the news under a dim light in a room with no heating. The news filled my heart with an indescribable gloomy feeling, as if I had been covered by a black veil. A little girl took her last breath in that concrete corridor with no one to watch over her. I'm sure she wanted to die in her mother's arms. She must have been so helpless and scared. She must have suffered so much pain. Every time I think of Michiko, my heart aches for her, and I cannot help crying. I am the only one who knows what happened to her, but she will never be forgotten as long as I live.